Thanks everybody for joining us. A monumental election, one can say, a couple days ago, and we want to sort of get to the bottom of what happened, maybe why it happened, and then what it portends for the future, both in terms of um, uh, domestic and some foreign policy questions. Joining us is John Zogby, brother, pollster. Um, Jerry Seib, who for many years was the bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal here in Washington, and an astute analysis of American politics and American policy on a range of issues. And Lara Friedman, who's from Foundation for Middle East Peace, and probably the person who knows what is going on or not going on in Congress, and issues related again to the Middle East, and Maya Berry, who's my partner in crime at the Arab American Institute. Best known these days as the person who got beat up in a Senate Judiciary Committee, but we'll leave that for later. That is a question I do want to ask you about. Listen, John, let me start with you. The election itself. What happened and what lessons are there to learn from this?
It was an astonishing victory for Donald Trump that no one really forecast accurately. There was a sense that maybe the close election would finally break one way or another, but no one thought the break to Donald Trump. When you look at the numbers, they really are astonishing because he built on support of over 2016 and 2020 in every single one of the 50 states. And equally astounding, I'm using superlatives here, is the demographic expansion that he created. When the MAGA movement was born, it was really a coalition of the Tea Party, anger, folks who genuinely disliked Hillary Clinton, and then many traditional conservatives who saw an opportunity to get into the White House. But now when you look at the results of the election, he expanded his support among women, expanded his support among young voters to the point where he won handsomely among young men in particular. He received, on one hand, 14% of the black vote, which is an increase and improvement, but 19% of black men. He actually, we all caught these demographics. We just didn't get the horse race. Among Latinos, once and for all, the polls were correct. Latinos, Trump actually won among them. And what Democrats are going to have to learn is that this is not a monolithic, one-dimensional vote or voice. Fastest growing elements in the Latino community are folks coming from places like Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba. In addition to that, young and middle-aged working class Latino men, very conservative, as are the thousands of evangelicals that are coming in as well. I think what was the most surprising is that Mr. Trump has taken every opportunity to insult people, and that includes veterans. And yet he won a majority of the vote of veterans. What he has created, at least for now, is a genuine populist movement that is much bigger. It's actually, as of this vote and as of its makeup, it is a majoritarian movement in the United States. And so Democrats are going to be wise not only to study and learn, what happened and how were these groups lost. They're going to have to deal with it because it's not a working class party under any circumstances among any race. And I can go on, but I'm going to stop right there.
Thanks, John. I just one question. did did Democrats lose or did Trump win? Or is it both?
Both.
And
Yeah.
tell me about the Democrats losing part. Some people criticized me when I said that they blew it by not understanding the electorate that they had the possibility of winning over. Is that right?
It is. It is right. When Barack Obama set the standard, for the Obama coalition. But, a junior partner in that coalition were evangelical Christians. We know that there are liberal Jimmy Carter, evangelical Christians. So Obama set the standard of 30%. And every candidate since Obama has got 30% of evangelicals. Harris got 17% of evangelicals. By the same token, Trump got 83% of evangelicals. And again, talk about a group that, was insulted. Christians, conservative Christians, with traditional values. And here's a guy that doesn't represent any of that, setting a record, at least as far as I can tell, going back among this group. And so, yeah, the losses were palpable. Trump gained. There's a marriage gap in the United States, actually as pronounced as there is a gender gap. The marriage gap was 21 points between married voters and single voters. I don't know if that's a record, but wow, it's huge.
Jerry, one question that comes to mind is what does this mean? This majoritarian populist movement. It is it. Let me back up. For too long, uh, all three of his races, the media would say, "Oh, he really blew it this time." I mean, for example, he insulted Puerto Ricans, and they said that did it for him. He won Puerto Rican votes in communities where they were numerous. He would insult women and still win a significant number of women voters. Threat to Muslims, he won Muslim votes in several communities. Um, is this a sustainable populist movement? Is there a bill that at some point is due and he can't pay up, or what is it saying to us right now about the state of our democracy moving forward?
Well, I think the first thing it says is that people have learned to, for better or worse, to simply look past what Donald Trump says and how he portrays himself and others. And that may be a good thing, it may be a bad thing, but after, three cycles of saying to ourselves, well, he's gone too far this time, clearly there is no limit that we can find out there in which he will have gone too far in stylistic terms. What it says to me is that this populist majoritarian coalition he's put together, to use John's terms, is real and it's probably sustainable. I'm working on a piece right now for the weekend review section of the Journal, which I hope you'll all read. It's probably posting tomorrow, trying to answer the question of what went wrong for Democrats, which is the flip side of what went right for Trump. And what has struck me the most is, and Jim and John, we've all talked about this amongst ourselves in the past, is the extent of the Democrats' loss of their traditional economic and cultural constituencies. Kamala Harris won among voters who make $25,000 a year or less, and she won among those making $100,000 a year or more, and Trump won everybody in the middle. And so I think you're looking at a Democratic Party that has become dominated by financial and educated elites, and that has lost touch with people in the middle of the country. And it turns out that was not a phenomenon of 2016, it's an enduring phenomenon. And Trump's genius is that he has figured out that he can appeal to those people, and that in some ways his style, his insults, his bravado, his exaggerations somehow make those people think that he's a strong leader, even if they don't believe what he says. It's a very strange phenomenon, but I think Democrats have to come to grips with the reality that this is possible only because they've lost touch with some of the people who ought to be their core supporters.
Here's the thing. He ran as a populist, focusing a lot on appealing to the middle class. Lindsey Graham said famously, let's face it, he said, we've become the party of the working class and Democrats are the party of elites. Promises to working people about their income, about their jobs, about the security in their futures. And to women, I'll protect you, and to, a whole range of people. But then that's the one side of a populist movement that actually is more the way Democrats would appeal to voters 50, 60 years ago. And then on the other side, there's this enormous fear among several constituencies of policies that he'll pursue, and that he was using this rhetoric to mask this other agenda.
Yeah.
Weigh that out for me in terms of where you think this goes.
Well, I think that's a really important question, and somebody I was talking with earlier today framed it this way: when does buyer's remorse set in among some of these people who voted for Donald Trump? When the tariffs go into effect, for example, what will the business supporters actually think of the guy they've just helped elect? What will average consumers think when they pay the bill for those tariffs? What will, and I have people in my own family who said this to me, well, we've got to vote for Trump because we can't have these big spending Democrats in anymore. What will they think when they realize that Donald Trump will expand the deficit and the federal debt at twice the rate that Kamala Harris would have if her policies have been put into effect? So I don't know when that happens, but I am pretty confident it will happen. The one thing about Donald Trump is that he's not attached to anything. He's totally transactional. And if tariffs seem like a good idea now, but if they start setting off inflation later, he'll figure out a way to pivot away from them and do something completely different. So people who invested in Donald Trump thinking they knew what he was going to do may be surprised. And even if he does what he said he was going to do, I think buyer's remorse is a very real possibility, but not immediately.
Jump in here.
On that school, yeah, John, and then I want to go to Maya for something. Yeah, John.
Yeah, let's not get too far ahead of ourselves and go long term with this MAGA coalition. We all remember the Obama coalition, which died on Tuesday, once and for all. He's got to govern now, and that's where the proof will be in the pudding. He's going to have to institute these promises that he has made, which will not only start to congeal opposition to him, among Democrats and among liberals, but also, as Jerry points out, among some of his own supporters who are going to see the deficit go up, are going to see consumer prices go up if these tax, for example, which won't happen, but his tariffs on Chinese-made products. That's all. He's got to go. That's going to be the hard part.
I wonder. It didn't happen last time with a lot of the policies he pursued, but let me just switch to Maya for a second. Maya had a conversation with a reporter a little while ago, asking me, "What do you say about the fact that the far right in the American Jewish community endorsed Trump, and a lot of conservative Muslims and Arabs endorsed Donald Trump? Is this a marriage that can last?" She asked me. Talk to that for a minute about what happened in the Arab community, as we know, on this election, and what it also portends for the future. Do we have an Arab American community moving away from Democratic Party, as for example, the last almost 20 years, they were voting largely Democratic?
Yeah, so I would answer it in two ways, right? So the first is how do we define the Arab American community? And I think that's a really important piece to kind of ground our conversation. I'm from Michigan. Dearborn is my hometown. I'm a Dearborn kid, so I'm going to always emphasize Dearborn, Michigan, but I think it's important to understand that that's a pocket and not representative of the national Arab American community or the national Arab American vote in its totality. So one of the first things I think we have to understand is when a local mayor who's Arab American and Muslim makes an endorsement there. It's about issues and things playing out in Metro Detroit. It's not necessarily, I think, an indicative of where the broader vote would go. In terms of, are they shifting away one way or the other? I mean, look, our polling has shown us, the one we did in October of 23 had Democrats at the lowest margin ever since we've been polling, since John has been polling in the mid 90s. Kamala becoming the nominee increased that. We saw a split of 38% to 38% in our last poll before the election. But again, that's a lot more even between Republicans and Democrats than it had ever been recently. So there's that. But the second point I would make is going back to the Dearborn example. I think we have to be cautious, when we're in the middle right now of doing our analysis, and we are looking at precincts in the south end of Dearborn, and we are looking at precincts in East Dearborn, and we're looking at precincts in West Dearborn, but we're also looking at precincts in Livonia and Bay Ridge, New York, and Lackawanna City, Houston, Texas, and Paterson, New Jersey. The point is, in order for us to kind of get a sense of what happened in this election, we've got to broaden significantly that scope. So we put out the election night on our Twitter feed, a thread that talked about roughly 2.6 million eligible voters in the Arab American community. We highlighted the states in which they appear there, and until we get frankly actual numbers that allow us to do the precinct by precinct analysis to get a better sense of that, I think we ought to hold back on the Arab Americans voted for this, Arab Americans supported this. It reminds me of when folks would say the majority of the American Muslim community supported George Bush in 2000. That's just not a factually accurate statement based on data. So we're going to get there on the data piece, and look forward to kind of sharing that analysis when it's done. But having said all that, I'm going to come back to the Dearborn example. Yeah, I had family members who aren't Republicans, who don't identify that way, for the first time saying they didn't listen to us. They didn't give us a single reason to do this. And every day in the mail, I got this, and I cannot vote for the Democrats. And some of them voted for Cornel West, and some of them voted for Trump completely as a protest vote. That absolutely did happen.
Mm-hmm. Lara, Congress. There's going to be a Republican Senate. There may be a Republican House. And it is not as if the House has been, under Democratic or Republican leadership, has been balanced or even friendly on issues involving Israel, Palestine, or broader concerns in the Middle East. What happens if Congress, both houses, stay in terms of policy toward the war in Gaza, policy toward Lebanon, policy toward Iran, and America's military and presence in the Middle East? And then I want to ask you later a question about some of the domestic concerns about free speech and IRA definition, et cetera. But first, start on the foreign policy side. What does it look like will be happening in this new Congress, assuming that we're going to get both houses Republican?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I actually, starting at Congress, want to start and say, I mean, I appreciate it's been 2 days and we're trying to do big, deep analysis. I think one of the data points that needs to be recalled is that some of the Democrats in Congress who are more progressive outperformed Harris significantly at the polls. So when we're talking about the Democrats and the Democratic Party versus Republicans, I think that data point has to be taken into account, because I think it says a lot about the failures of the Democrats in this election, which really felt a lot like the failures of the Democrats 8 years ago in the last election that Mr. Trump won. I think it's also worth noting that we're still waiting to see what the final numbers are on turnout. My sense of talking to people around the country is that turnout was a big piece of this. If the Democratic Party thought that they would win by essentially not engaging with their base, particularly on the more progressive things that they found awkward to deal with, and instead bringing out Liz Cheney and others to try to peel people away from Republicans, it doesn't seem to have worked. Republicans didn't peel away towards them, and a lot of their base either voted Republican or didn't vote at all. And as they look to learn lessons, and there's going to be a lot of debate on the role of Gaza and other issues on this election, and not just in Michigan. This is a question for voter turnout more broadly, but the fact that you have people like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar who outperformed Harris in these elections, I think is a data point that is extremely important to pay attention to. Sorry, Maya, go ahead.
I just want to come in on this point because it's incredibly important. Alyssa Slotkin outperformed Harris in the state of Michigan. So there are multiple Senate races where the top of the ticket went to Trump and the senators were actually the other way. So I think it's an incredibly important point.
Yeah. Thank you. In terms of Congress, look, I mean, I think this is a moment for people to take a deep breath and start thinking seriously if you are in favor of legislation in Congress that once and for all ends the U.S. relationship with the UN, or that once and for all makes it impossible to ever fund UNRWA again, or that essentially targets Palestinians in pretty much any way that members of Congress can think creatively to do, then this is probably a really great moment for you. Congress, I think, is really poised to support the Trump administration and even push it on things like supporting annexation of the West Bank, in terms of continuing to arm Israel to do whatever it wants in Gaza, in Lebanon, and further afield, potentially in Iran, and including the possibility, I would say, increasingly, of annexing parts of Lebanon. I think that's all on the table. And I warned people 8 years ago to take the Trump folks seriously when they came into office 8 years ago, when they said there are all these things that they were going to do. And essentially the reaction was, well, come on, don't be crazy. This is just talk, and they'll be moderated once they get into office. I don't see how you come in moderated when you're bringing into office with you the experience of that previous 4-year term in office, and you're bringing a lot of the same advisors in. So if people are hoping, this, I remember 8 years ago, immediately after Trump was elected, I was at an event for the 2 days after the election with a bunch of the Israeli left, who basically poo-pooed what I was saying and said, he's going to come into office, he'll be a normal president, he'll behave within normal bounds, and he wants to make deals, so maybe he'll be Nixon to China and do great things. I told them then that was delusional thinking, and I think it's delusional thinking now.
Let's go on the domestic side in terms of free speech.
Jim,
Jerry?
Can I just add one point there? I was thinking, I'm trying to imagine what is the thing that Prime Minister Netanyahu could do that would cause President Trump to say, well, that's too far. And I can't come up with one right now. So anyway.
Lara,
I say there's nothing that Bibi could do that would make Biden say he had gone too far. With that as the backdrop, and still members of Congress on the right, Republicans and some Dems, challenged the Biden administration for being too tough on Bibi when he basically stood and gave cover and provisioned and diplomatic support for everything that he's done over the past year plus. The one tiny pseudo limit they put on it was the export of one kind of bomb, which Israel had enough of already. And that was enough to say, you've betrayed our friend Israel. It's very difficult to think of anything that Trump could do that would be a line for Trump, that Bibi
Netanyahu would do. Yeah.
Yes, the Bibi could do to be a line for Trump, unless it's something that's just personal. I mean, Trump is clearly a very he's got a lot of ego, and he's somewhat chaotic in his thinking, and I could imagine that there might be something personal, but I imagine a lot of people would intervene very quickly to try to fix that. Free speech.
Free speech. Yeah. I mean, this is not Trump. This is Congress. It's Virginia Fox. It's Elise Stefanik. It's this new congressional report on campuses. Is that going to accelerate? And now with control of, if they have control of both houses and the presidency, some warn that we're entering a kind of a McCarthy-like era in terms of what's allowed and what's not allowed on campus, and what speech is taboo. Where does it go?
Yeah, look, I mean, I've been talking about new McCarthyism, a new Red Scare for quite a while now. It is certainly implausible that the Republican efforts to move, basically to use the false the false flag of we are fighting anti-Semitism in order to target everything that they consider woke or hostile to their agenda. I don't see why that would stop. It was enormously successful over the past few years, and it actually was so successful that it captured a lot of Democrats who supported it as well. This agenda started under Trump. I mean, it was not new, but we had, Ken Marcus in the Trump administration and the efforts around the IRA definition that started, to gain steam under Trump. It continued with Congress for the past 4 years. I would expect it to continue now. I will say, and I'm not saying this is a silver lining, but I think it's worth noting that where this agenda has hit some walls so far in Congress, it has been because of Republicans. And I mean, like I would just say there's been for instance, most recently there's a big piece there's a piece in Axios, the breaking news about Schumer maybe moving the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act in lame duck, which is the act to take the IRA definition of anti-Semitism and put it into law. And it was framed as something that there's been support for doing all along, but Schumer has blocked it because of liberal Democrats. Except that actually isn't true. It was passed in the House months ago and was immediately opposed by a huge spectrum of the right, ranging from the actual anti-Semites who said you can't pass this law because it'll make it illegal to be anti-Semitic, which it wouldn't, all the way to the free speech libertarians, and then across to people like Batya Ungar-Sargon and Eugene Volokh, who basically are saying this is an overreach, it's a violation of free speech, and it's a form of stealth DEI. So, I think there are some breaks potentially on how far they'll go, not because people care about the free speech of students on campus or the right of people to protest Israel, but because I think there's going to be those who say we absolutely, want to stand with the Jewish people, by which they mean supporters of Israel, but not at the cost of these fundamental values that we are seeking to promote across the board.
Okay, one last question, and for you and Maya, UNRWA. Israel has taken a very clear position now on wanting to make it illegal to exist and operate in Israel, but also for others to support it. And then we have a letter from Austin and Blinken to Netanyahu about allowing humanitarian aid into Gaza by the 15th, or else face a suspension of U.S. assistance as per the law, which actually should be done now instead of waiting for another 8 days or so. The question is, I see no way on earth that by the 15th they're going to allow it. If they ban UNRWA, then that does have a huge impact on the distribution of aid. Play this out. Where does this go, Maya, and then Lara? Could you just talk about that a minute, and then maybe hear from Jerry and John if they don't deliver on it, if the administration doesn't then suspend the aid. What does that look like? What does it say about this administration's policy or lack thereof? Maya, what do you think?
Yeah, so what happened, it's similar to how Lara just answered Jerry's question about what's the line that Trump would say no to, and the issue was Biden never said no, right? UNRWA has become one of those flashpoints where they've taken the only entity that exists because of the creation of the State of Israel to provide services and aid to nearly 6 million Palestinian refugees, and have turned it into this flashpoint to say, if you support UNRWA, it's like supporting Hamas. We're literally there now, and there's a significant number of members of Congress who've taken that route. And the objective isn't just from, I think, the incredibly immoral position of enabling the genocide while it's underway. It's also to remove this issue of final status issue of the Palestinian refugees and their right of return. That the targeting of UNRWA has been on Israel's agenda for a very long time because of that. And now we have the folks here adopting that sort of similar approach. I mean, Donald Trump's administration was the first to cut UNRWA before the charges post October 7th. The Biden administration jumped on the bandwagon before there was any conclusive evidence of anything. And the Congress acted by placing a ban that's supposed to expire in March of 2025. Do I think this ban is going to be allowed to expire? I mean, it's alarming to think about what may be coming down the pike, given who this administration is and who's going to be in charge in Congress. That's for me the bigger sort of concern on this. Lara, I'll turn it over to you from that piece of it.
Yeah, I mean, look, the Trump administration cut off aid to UNRWA for things unrelated to terror. They've tried to rewrite that. I actually published something last week just because I couldn't take it anymore. I did research tracking every single statement made by anyone associated with the Trump administration in the period before they cut off aid to UNRWA and after, and they never mentioned terrorism. This was always a political goal of seeking to make other people pay the costs of Palestinian refugees, trying to erode the status of Palestinian refugees, and trying to end the refugee issue by effectively taking UNRWA out of saying if we don't have UNRWA, we don't have refugees, done. It's not going to work. It wouldn't have worked then. It's not going to work now. Palestinians don't consider them refugees because the UN gives them refugee cards. By the way, any more than, Jews throughout the ages talked about next year in Jerusalem. It wasn't because the UN said they could. It's because this is your national, narrative historical memory. Somehow, my people never forgot it over thousands of years, but Palestinians are supposed to forget it over 70. So there you go. In terms of, what happens when this date expires from the Blinken and letter, I mean, the Biden administration has effectively, I would say, trained the Israeli government to ignore them. I don't know why we'd expect that to change now that they're in a lame duck situation. So I don't believe anything that they say now has any weight for this Israeli government. On top of that, we have a Democratic intelligentsia, which is analyzing this election. And lots of people are saying, well, you lost because you weren't pro-Israel enough. It's very hard for me to believe that coming out of this loss, you're suddenly going to see backbone from the Biden administration to actually stand up to Israel. And if the most powerful thing you can say to anyone is you can't let UNRWA fail because it'll be a humanitarian catastrophe. As I tweeted out earlier today, humanitarian catastrophe is a feature, not a bug, of Israel's policy right now. The dream right now is to create such a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza that eventually everybody leaves or the international community intervenes to save them and move them someplace else. Yay, they're gone. A humanitarian catastrophe in the Shofat refugee camp in East Jerusalem, which has been a thorn in the side of Israel for decades. Fine, let them all go someplace else. Let them leave the West Bank if they can't survive. That is a feature of this. It is not a bug.
Jerry, it may already be answered, but how bad does it look? And does it matter to the Biden folk if they look bad by creating an ultimatum, maybe the first one of their administration, and then simply not doing anything about it?
Well, first of all, I agree with everything Lara had said, except I would add this somewhat contrarian footnote possibly, which is if there's one advantage to being a lame duck and having a lame duck session of Congress is that you're liberated. You don't have to worry anymore about what people think or what the political consequences are. Joe Biden's never running for office again. Kamala Harris does not have to build an administration and a coalition to govern over the next 4 years. They are free to vote to do what their conscience tells them to do. So maybe
Can I just ask though? I mean, you guys are all more on elections than I am. My guess is that right now, the elections advisors are saying you may not have a future in politics, but in 2 years we're going to have a midterm election where we hope to gain some seats back. Don't screw these people by doing something on Israel. I'm pretty sure that's what they're being told.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that's true. I'm just saying, if you're Joe Biden and everybody's turned their backs on you, you can say, you know what, I don't care anymore. I'm not predicting that. I'm just saying that's a possibility. I think that to me the frightening possibility here is that I spent 3 years as you know, Jim, based in the Middle East, and we're now contemplating things that just would have been unimaginable then. I mean, first of all, I think the two-state solution is pretty much dead for the foreseeable future, and we're actually talking seriously about a campaign to depopulate Gaza and the West Bank of Palestinians. I mean, this is like astonishing stuff. So leaving aside what happens in the lame duck, that will be small potatoes compared to the kinds of things we're talking about over the next 4 years, which I just find, I mean, it's my jaw drops when I think about the fact we're actually having those kinds of issues under serious discussion.
John, what is it?
You know,
Talk to me about Laura's observation there that these folks never give up. The consultants, et cetera, are locked into a mindset. They think that they won, that their judgment calls were right, and what they said this year will carry over in 2 years, and so they won't want to change anything in terms of policy on this issue.
yeah, especially after they get done counting their money, which they made a lot out in losing. Well, one thing I think that's important to note, and I've never seen a number like this before, where Kamala Harris did excel was in the Jewish vote. She got 80% of the Jewish vote. I've never seen a number that high before. And it suggests to me that a lame duck president either can say, hey, I've got a little slack here. We got some extra Jewish votes I can afford to take a harder line, or can say, well, look, this is the one group that not only stayed loyal, but was even more loyal to me this time, and I better keep them, to ensure that, they're in the fold for the next time. But if we, 80%.
With regard, Jerry, one last question, then I want to go to Maya and see what we've got out there. John mentioned the consultants and the money. One one issue that I've been raising for a number of years is the role of this consulting class that are not unlike what Ben Rhodes would say about the foreign policy blob. It's guys from previous administrations, win or lose, they keep coming back and they've got the same stuff to offer. Well, the consultant class is somewhat the same. They've been doing campaigns, winning, losing, but they actually never lose because they always make their money. And it's a huge industry. I mean, what, $10 billion this cycle in terms of expenditures from the two sides? That's a lot of money for a small group of consulting groups. They have a stranglehold on this process. I don't believe that we have a democracy anymore as much as we have an industry of consulting groups and big money that are actually shaping all the contours of elections. It's not like we have a Democratic Party organization and a Republican Party organization. We've got consulting classes and virtual campaigns of TV ads and newspaper ads, but more importantly now social media ads and direct mail and email and all that. It's is that the future of our politics? Is that we'll be consumers of this information in this way, and we become a commodity for the consultants?
Well, I think we already are to some extent, which is a sad thing to say. But I will say that I have a friend who is fairly sarcastic about these things, who wrote something recently in which he said, if I were Kamala Harris, my first question would be, where do I go to get my money back? Because, the Democrats had not an unlimited amount of money, but close to. And what did it buy them? It bought them the worst, in some ways, I think the worst loss for the party since 1980 when Reagan came in. But your point is right. The consultants get their paychecks at the end of the day. They go off to their vacation homes for 6 months, and then they come back and start the whole thing over again. Is that cycle, can it be ended? I don't know, except that I actually think that some politician has to break through and show there's a different model, that you don't need this, you can break out, go around the scrum and win by not following that traditional playbook. I don't know who that's going to be or when that might happen, but that's the only way that I can think of where this cycle that you just aptly described is broken.
Maya?
Yeah, so I'm going to go to a question that both Ava and Wally have asked, and John, I want to take this to you. After saying don't look at Dearborn as for the national, I'm going to say in Dearborn returns we saw Trump at 42, Harris at 36, 6%, and Jill Stein at 18%. So the question is specifically, what role did third parties or the candidacy of Jill Stein have on this election? Let's start with you, John.
I mean, essentially it was the anti-Biden vote that got split multiple ways. Again, Donald Trump will perform as, in this case, the protest against Harris. Talk about overperforming. Jill Stein got 0.3 nationwide, but 18% in Dearborn. There was another area for protest votes to go. I'd be very curious to see what the turnout was in Dearborn, whether the turnout was dampened, because that would then be the third element of the protest. Folks that may have voted for U.S. Senate and Congress and down ballot but skipped presidency. And I'm thinking of that uncommitted primary vote.
Yeah, so turnout was 62% in 2020, and thus far it's at 55% for 2024. But that also is not looking at the undervote, right? We've not been able to analyze who didn't vote for the top of the ticket, but yet voted in some other races.
And I'm sure it's there. I'm sure it's there.
Yeah. Jerry, do you want to add anything on the Stein point, or Lara?
I mean, I continue to wonder what Jill Stein thinks she's accomplishing, but that's questions off in the stratosphere somewhere. I will say that I thought, and a lot of people thought, this would be the cycle in which independent or third party candidates would actually make a big difference, and in the end they didn't. They may have made a big difference in isolated spots like Dearborn, but not generally, and it's hard to imagine in an environment that is this jaundiced and this anti-establishment, if they can't make ground this time, will they ever?
Let's take another question from Eddie, who's saying, how can progressives or the anti-Trump political camp in general build a coalition to counter the repercussions of Trumpism in the United States? And then specifically looking at the next 4 years with regards to the Middle East and pro-Palestinian positioning. Who wants to start with that one?
I'm going to jump in, and maybe this is counterintuitive. Going back to what I said earlier about, what's going to potentially be the brakes on, legislation and acts to challenge free speech and right to protest and academia. One of the things when I think about some of the people who I know I'm seeing on social media who either voted protest for a third-party candidate or who voted for Trump in protest or didn't vote, is they're not necessarily behind a MAGA agenda. The vote in this election does not mean a buy-in on every piece of what this administration is going to do, or even any of what it's going to do. And I think, one of the things that may be healthy for the electorate after this election is realizing that this idea that there are strict party lines and you can only work with and agree with people on your side. I think that whichever side you're on, there's probably at least as many people you don't agree with as people you do agree with, and that the work that needs to get done may end up for maybe the first time in my lifetime, if it's going to be effective, looking less and less partisan in terms of where it lives. And that also, I think, in and of itself could have something of a healing effect as we come into, assuming we're ever going to have elections again, into what the next election cycle looks like. I think a lot of the electorate sent a message to Democrats this year, the traditional Democrat electorate, saying, don't just assume I'm going to vote Democrat because I have before. I suspect you're going to see a lot of people changing their registration from Democrat to independent, sending that message even more clearly. So, as we try to figure out what it looks like to work for things you care about, not as a member of a party, but as a citizen, I think that can have downstream effects that can reverberate in a very healthy way across our system.
Jim, do you want to add to that point? If we were to believe this election saw 32%, I think, identifying as Democrats. You've talked for a very long time about you can't get a party you can't get a voter to support a party if they don't know what that party stands for. So just maybe if you can offer a bit on that as well.
The bigger issue is not just what the party stands for, but does the party exist? And I think we're at the point where we no longer have what we used to think of as political parties. Mom was a precinct worker and went to ward meetings, and there was an organizational structure, and you said, I'm a Democrat, and had a card, and you went to meetings. That exists in some communities, but rare. for the most part, being a Democrat is I'm on a mailing list. I get emails begging me for money at the last minute before the deadline. Um, I get robocalls. I get direct mail. That's what that's the only association most people have with the parties. And what we're finding is that in particular, when we look at ethnic groups, um, the immigrant communities and younger people have no party ID because they don't. I grew up in a culture of being a Democrat. Couldn't imagine marrying a Republican or having my kids marry a Republican. I mean, it just was alien to our thinking. But that's not the case right now for people. It's especially for, like I said, immigrants and younger people. They don't have that culture of being in something, and there's no organization to bring them in. And so what we have instead of two parties are two huge fundraising mechanisms who dispensed money out to consulting groups, Republican consulting groups and Democratic consulting groups who spend that money. And us, instead of being members of parties, we are, like I said, we're commodities. Um, we're consumers who pay them money, and we're commodities that they use to kind of mobilize us virtually to come out and do things. And that I think is disturbing. So yeah, what we're seeing in particular with Arabs is a fluctuation of, depending upon what the candidate is saying, I'm on this side or I'm on that side. But that's not the same as being a part of a political party. And I worry about where this is taking us as we go forward, because that's why it was so easy for Donald Trump to conquer the Republican Party. He built a virtual organization of followers stronger than their organization because it didn't exist, and took it over. And that's why Democrats, I think, have such a weak structure right now, because it's basically a conglomerate of consulting groups whose job it is both to raise money and spend money, and maybe nothing more.
Can I
I'd
just?
like to build on that. Well, go ahead, Jerry.
Oh, I was just going to say that I totally agree with that. I wrote a piece some months ago saying if you want more stable politics in America, you should want stronger parties. And that's also the answer to your question, Jim, earlier about is there an alternative to the consultants who basically take all the money and run negative campaigns? Well, the alternative is parties that are designed to bring people together, put up some guardrails, and keep people in a sane spot in between the guardrails on the road. Those parties don't exist, and if you want to change this phenomenon that you're describing, you got to have stronger parties.
And that's why they don't stand for anything. That's why there's no, the platforms that get written every 4 years, nobody ever reads them. I was chair of the resolutions committee in the DNC, and we had a member of the resolutions committee who put forward a resolution saying that the DNC should evaluate members of Congress by their votes. Did they adhere to or not adhere to the party platform? The staff at the party ruled that resolution ineligible for a vote because it would, they thought it would be too problematic. But the platform meant nothing, in other words, and most people don't even read them.
John, I
Sorry.
know you want to come in on this, but I also want to ask you a question from the chat.
Sure.
Can you hear us?
Yeah,
Okay.
go
So Steve is pointing out the quote regarding the Jewish American voted 80%. Steve is pointing out that there's wild divergence on that issue. Media Consortium came in at 78%. Fox was at 66%. I saw one based on the Jewish American vote in Pennsylvania that said, though it came from the Orthodox Union, that it said Trump won at 48%. So maybe a lesson in exit polling super quick for us.
Yeah, I make the mistake every 4 years of reading the early exit polls and finding out that they only reflect those who have voted already, and not the later voters on election day, or voters that have not been counted yet. So this is from the final exit poll dump, and it came in at 80%. Earlier, it was different, 78%. I didn't see the 66, and I didn't see the Trump victory, but there were figuring out who they are and what really happened. I would really discourage them from doing the Adam Schiff thing, which is to come right out of the chute, pushing for impeachment and pushing for an obsession and obstruction because they disagree with Trump. The mistake that was made last time was that Trump did not get a traditional honeymoon. The media jumped on him immediately. Democrats jumped on him immediately. And that is not the way you rebuild a base. Everybody knows what Democrats are against. We also know what Donald Trump is against. But this is the time to give him his due and don't make him a second-term victim before you even try to take the time to figure out who the hell you are and what you stand for. And so I just hope that they don't make that mistake and give him his 100 days.
Can I add to that?
Please.
Just to add, obviously I'm someone who spends a lot of time looking at Israel. And I think if Democrats are learning lessons right now, I would strongly encourage them to look at the Labor Party in Israel, which essentially, since the early aughts, since the Second Intifada, adopted a policy of saying we can only win by attacking right. We are going to be destroyed because of these, liberal left ideas, whatever. And with each election, they attacked further right to the point where they are essentially viewed as Likud light, which didn't attract any Likud voters to them and lost them their own base, which is why today Labor essentially doesn't exist as a party. And the Israeli political spectrum is a spectrum that is largely confined to the right. It is a fight between the right-wing parties with some vestigial left-wing parties that actually don't have any power. I think that's a moment for the Democratic Party to really stop and think about what it stands for. I said to an Israeli friend in the Labor Party years ago, the Labor Party, I said, you're going to wear the issues related to Palestinians in heavy metal. You can either wear it as a crown and be proud of what you stand for and lay out a vision of something positive that you're going to achieve. And you can, if you lose on that, then you can criticize the guy who won when he doesn't do the right things. But you're going to wear it in heavy metal either as the crown or as a heavy chain that will pull you to the bottom of the Mediterranean in every election. They chose the heavy chain. And I fear that the lessons that have been learned by successive Democratic campaigns, and I think the Biden win was sort of an aberration of a response to Trump that they got lucky. But since as long as I can remember, the wisdom has been we can only win by attacking right. Well, I think this is a moment to sit here and look at and say, what do you stand for and is it working? Because if the only thing you can stand for is a slightly watered down version of what the other guy is standing for proudly and with charm and wit, much of which is maybe offensive to you, but really it captures people's energy and imagination, you're just going to keep losing. That's where it goes. And learn those lessons and figure out where you go from there.
We are almost done.
Can I just jump in? I can answer the mystery about the 66% of the Jewish vote, if that's useful.
Please.
That comes from the AP Votecast, which is their poll of 120,000 voters, which is their alternative to the exit polls, which, as John suggests, have become deeply flawed. But the AP Votecast had 66% of Jewish voters supporting Kamala Harris.
Thank you, Jerry. So we're at time, and there's a question that I think I'm going to ask you to answer and give us your closing thoughts on. Farah is asking, what do we do when politics fails? I would go further to add, what do we do when sort of the seeming democracy fails, right? We had a very unpopular policy in place by all accounts, majority of Americans, yet we saw no movement in the Biden administration at all on it. The uncommitted movement used the political process to no avail. Jim, you yourself have been advocating for things that you have never gotten from this party. Is it time to stop trying to work from inside? So just the angst about both the party itself and then our broader democracy in the middle of this genocide and not being able to have the impact, the outcome. If I can have each of you kind of come in for about a minute on that.
All right, I'll start. Look, we've spent 2 generations being only on the outside, and in fact, representing what other political parties would define us as leprosy, just not to be touched. And so here we are, we've battled, the Arab American Institute has battled and succeeded, and to a large degree gotten on the inside. The rules of the game are defined and you take the ugly. We had the ugly the other day, and so we've got to regroup and find out how to make the system work better for us. I have some thoughts that I'm going to share, over the next few days and weeks with Jim and with Maya on doing that. But this is the only game in town, and there is no other way to do it as far as I can.
Jerry?
I'll echo that. I think you just keep trying inside the system. Outside the system is not going to get you very far. I would persistence and perseverance tend to pay off. I would point to the conservative movement, which took them from 1964 when Lyndon Johnson killed Barry Goldwater until 1980 when Ronald Reagan finally won. That's 16 years to get from the wilderness to the promised land. And they just kept working at it. So I think that's, for better or worse, frustratingly or not, that's the solution in our system.
Lara?
Yeah, my answer is I think more focused on sort of the activist side. I mean, I think any party that's not listening to its base is going to lose. And there has been the base has achieved tremendous things, even as the party has become less and less influential and powerful. Think about what's happening in states with some of the abortion legislation. I mean, there's really good organizing going on, much of which actually does cross partisan lines. I think the people are showing the party what the way forward is. And this goes back whether it's the class of advisors who say, no, we know better, or we have a smarter way to win. But I don't see how you strengthen the political party system in democracy unless you listen to people. And that seems to be what a lot of the people were saying in this election when they said, I'm not going to vote the way you want me to. You can't take my vote for granted. And frankly, I'd rather give the other guy a chance and have you learn a lesson, which is a terrifying message when we're talking about our democracy being at stake. But it's completely understandable why some people did decide to go that way.
And I think just quickly from my end of it, as we do the voting analysis on this, we are looking at turnout. We're looking at folks who only voted down ballots. We're looking at young people as we talk about this sort of wave that shifted to him. How much of that was rooted in the conversation that's been happening since October 7th about Palestinians, about Gaza, the pain of the genocide. So there's a lot there, I think, to be looked at, including, again, the races where Harris didn't carry the state, but yet some of the individual senators and other House members did. So I think that for us, I would echo the sense of there's no alternative, but also I actually think there's been tremendous progress. It's hard to hear on a day like this, but there's been extraordinary progress. It broke through. It's why we are where we are on this issue, I think. Jim, why don't you close us out?
Just look on two levels. One is, as John said, I remember when we got money returned, candidates rejecting our endorsement, in unable to even get meetings with people in the political parties. And that was a kind of marginalization that was really painful and hurtful. And we had people in communities around the country where if you can't get a meeting with the mayor or a meeting with the city council, you're in trouble. You can't help your business. You can't help your family. You can't help your community grow. We are now in city councils. We are now mayors. We're now the majority in some cases of the city council, like in Dearborn, et cetera. We have a role. And look, on the issues that we've cared about in the Middle East, for the largest number of members of Congress calling for things we want, cutting aid or ending settlements, largest number of senators ever, a coalition that has been built that involves allies that we didn't have before in the Black community, Latino, Asian community, young people, progressive Jews. And it's made a difference. 350 cities passing ceasefire resolutions, mobilizations across the country that are very different than they were 50 years ago when it was 50 Palestinian guys in front of the White House. Now it's a couple thousand people in communities everywhere. So there has been real growth, and it has been growth within the electoral arena, where we defended we lost a couple, but we defended a lot of other members of Congress who might have lost without our financial support and our political support. This is not the time to take your foot off the gas. It's the time to figure out what we need to do to go further and defend issues that we care about. And I think as people start looking at lessons to be learned, one of the lessons that they're going to think about is what did they do wrong to lose support, not just of us, but of the whole coalition that defended and cared about these issues. So I come away from this not feeling rejected as much as angry and empowered and wanting to do more in the final years of my political work. I'm an old guy, but I want to keep going. I want to thank everybody, all of you for joining today, and all of you who listened in.